Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Murder on West Main by I. M. Foster, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Friday, August 19th, 1904, 7:45 a.m. Colin Brissedon hurried down the street, trying to make some order out of the mess of waves that covered his head. Why had he stopped at that saloon on the way home last night? Because you're a complete and total rounder, that's why. Hadn't Mr. Bryce cautioned him about coming in with another hangover? He could still hear the man bellowing about the firm's reputation, warning him that if he came in looking like something the cat dragged in once more, he was finished, degree from Columbia or not. That was just a week ago, and now he'd done it again. Well, maybe not to that extent, but another night like last night, and he was sure to be sliding down that slope once more, right back into the cesspit he'd so recently crawled out of. His stomach grumbled. The bacon and eggs he'd eaten that morning definitely weren't sitting well. A large belch rose unbidden from the depths of his gut, relieving some of his gastric stress, though it elicited a nasty scowl from one of the village matrons who happened to be passing by. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Thompson." She eyed him up and down before letting out an indignant huff and continuing up North Ocean Avenue. Frowning, he looked down toward his vest. Had he forgotten to fasten his fly? Shit! The problem wasn't his pants and but the buttons on his vest. He'd done it up cockeyed so that an extra button dangled off the bottom. That's all Bryce would need to see. Ducking into the alley behind Sweezy's department store, he undid the vest, quickly rebuttoning it before continuing on his way. Yep, he was teetering on the edge again. And after Mr. Grayson had been so decent about everything, sitting him down and talking to him like a concerned parent, quite the opposite of his bristly partner, he might add, Colin had never been so humiliated. The thought made him chuckle. Who was he trying to kid? He'd been far more humiliated on a number of occasions, and yet somehow hearing Grayson take him to task for his behavior had cut him to the core. Enough for him to stay away from booze for the next 5 days. But then last night, it had all ended in the gutter once more. He'd called Kathleen, as he did every Thursday, and once again she'd pleaded for him to ask Patrick's forgiveness and move back into Oak Street. Perhaps he should, but it had only been a little over 2 months since his father's crimes had come to light, and he just wasn't able to face it all yet. So instead, he'd drown his troubles in a bottle of cheap booze, which then resulted in this morning's wicked hangover. Why did he let it bother him so? Patrick would never approve of him moving back in. Yes, he would, and you know it because he's a decent human being, just like Kathleen. Checking once more to ensure his vest was buttoned correctly, he readjusted his collar and turned onto West Main Street, wondering what it must be like to be a decent fella. As he did, Mrs. Davis's youngest boys ran out in front of him, nearly causing him to tumble. He caught himself just as she grabbed each of them by an ear. "Apologize to Mr. Brissedon, you naughty little imps, or there'll be no ice cream for you later." The two boys mumbled what Colin assumed must have been a half-hearted apology before running off again. Mrs. Davis frowned, though her concern seemed to be more for him. "Are you unwell? You look rather pallid for such a handsome young man." He took his handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. "Something I ate didn't sit right, I'm afraid. Plus, this heat isn't helping any." "It certainly is warm, even for the dog days of summer." She reached into her purse and opened a packet of tablets. "Johnson's digestive tablets. Take 2 of these and you should be as right as rain again." "Thank you, ma'am, but I think I'll be fine once I'm inside and can get a glass of cool water." "Well, make sure you take the tablets as well. It can't hurt." She turned to the 2 boys who were now trying to shimmy up a lamppost. "Get down from there before I have to pull your ears clear off." She nodded goodbye and hurried on her way, so Colin tipped his hat and continued down West Main. He reached up to check his collar once more. "It's fine, nice and crisp, so is my suit, but Bryce is going to see past all of that if I don't relax." Taking a deep breath, he hurried past Bartlett's saloon, the site of his recent tumble from the sobriety wagon. He should give himself some credit, though. As hard as it had been, he'd managed to hang his suit up the night before rather than sleeping in it, as was his usual habit. He'd even staggered over to his bureau to check that he had a fresh fresh shirt, and a heavily starched collar for this morning. And though he had to drag himself out of bed before 6, he had still managed to shave in spite of the pounding in his head. On the surface, everything was as it should be, except... Stopping in front of Haven's general store, he removed his hat and used his fingers to brush back his hair once more. He'd been in such a rush to get to the office early, he had forgotten to comb his hair. As long as he didn't show any signs of a hangover, he should be fine, though. There was still a bit of tonic left from the night before, and though an unruly wave popped up here and there, for the most part, it seemed to be holding in place, at least for the moment. He crossed Havens Avenue, tipping his bowler to old Mrs. Schwartz before pulling out his key to open the door of Grayson and Bryce. Much to his surprise, it was already unlocked. Odd, but not completely unheard of for someone to be in this early. After hanging his hat on the rack, he called out, "Hello? Mr. Grayson, are you in?" He peeked through the open doorway, but the office was empty. Of course it was. Hadn't the man mentioned the day before he had a court case up in Riverhead this morning? Peeking into Mr. Bryce's office, he called out his name as well, but received no answer there either. He had taken to staying in the room upstairs of late, but surely Colin would have heard some movement by now if he was up there. Maybe they'd just forgotten to lock the door last night. Shrugging, he sat down at his desk and started working on a brief that Mr. Bryce had requested for Monday afternoon. Before long, however, he realized some of the information he needed was in the man's office. He stood up, suppressing a groan and chiding himself yet again for falling off the wagon the night before. Tonight he was going to go straight back to the boarding house and spend all of the next day in bed. The information he was looking for was in a file on the cabinet to the left of Mr. Bryce's desk. He looked up at the clock. 20 to 9 already. The other employees would start strolling in any moment now. Best to slip in and get the file before either of the other clerks got in. They'd just tell him he wasn't allowed in there, which was generally true, but he needed that file, and it wasn't as if he was going to be searching through Bryce's desk drawers or anything. A shadow moved outside the window, and he turned to look, but it was just old Mrs. Schwartz heading back home. At least he thought it looked like her, though he couldn't really get a good look from where he was standing. Shaking his head, he hurried into the office and went straight for the cabinet. The file was right where he thought it would be. Grabbing it, he turned, thinking about the bottle of whiskey he knew the old man kept in his top desk drawer. But no, Mr. Grayson had put his faith in him. For once in his life, he'd like to live up to someone's expectations instead of descending to them. He took a quick peek in the file, then looked up, intent on heading for the outer office, but he stopped cold in his tracks. Mr. Bryce sat in his big leather office chair, the seat turned away from his desk so that he was staring right up at Colin. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know you were here, or I would have knocked. I've been working on that brief for Monday and needed this file to..." He trailed off. The man didn't even acknowledge him, let alone chastise him. In fact, he didn't move a muscle. Sweet mother! Colin dropped the folder and reached out toward Bryce, half hoping he'd wake and start growling at him. But no, though the man's skin was still warm to the touch, his green eyes stared into nothingness, and there appeared to be a cloth of some sort in his mouth. Colin's fingers shook as he touched the lawyer's neck, searching for a pulse, but he already knew the answer. Mr. Ezekiel Bryce was dead as a doornail. Before Colin could even straighten back up, the front door was flung open, and the police came through, their billy clubs at the ready. "You'd best be stepping back, Mr. Brissedon," Sergeant Owens of the local constabulary said. Colin remembered him from the investigation into his father's death. He'd always seemed like a reasonable man. Surely he'd listen to Colin's explanation, but it would probably be best to follow his instructions first. He stood up straight and moved off to the side. "I'm afraid he's dead, Sergeant, though I've no idea how or when it happened. I came in early to work on a brief, but didn't think anyone else was here. The front door was unlocked, however, which I did find a little odd." The sergeant nodded. "We got an anonymous call saying someone was lurking about down here." Leaning over, he felt the man's neck. "Still fairly warm," he called to one of his men. "You'd better go see if you can locate the doc." "Which one?" the younger man said. "Dr. O'Halloran, I reckon. I saw Dr. Tennyson heading out of town about an hour ago. Try the hotel first, and if he's not there, stop by Newens. He usually takes his breakfast there." The man went on his way, and the sergeant turned back to Colin. "I suppose we'd best step into the outer office." Nodding for Colin to sit behind his desk, the sergeant took the seat across from him. Now, you want to tell me again what you were doing here so early? The knob on the door rattled, and Caleb Bradley, another of the clerks, came in. What happened? He looked over at Colin. Why are the police here? Did you and Mr. Bryce have another altercation? Altercation? The sergeant raised an eyebrow and shifted his gaze back to Colin. It was nothing, just a little misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Caleb said. He threatened to give you the sack if you showed up in that state again. Owens leaned back in his chair. And what state would that be? Colin rubbed his forehead. None of this was helping his headache. I drank a bit too much the night before and had slept in my clothes. I had a hangover and hadn't even bothered to shave. And you had another altercation this morning, the sergeant said. Was it over your current state? What? No, I've got a bit of a headache, but I'm more than presentable. The policeman's gaze shot to Colin's hair. In such a hurry you forgot to put a comb through your hair then, were you? Actually, yes, I was. I told you I wanted to get here early and start on a brief for Mr. Bryce. I thought if I could get in before him, it would make up for my recent behavior. Caleb frowned, his hands clenched at his sides. Or maybe you wanted to get here before him so you could attack him without anyone else looking on. You've really done it now. He's bound to press charges. I'm afraid Mr. Bryce is beyond that, Owen said, though we have no reason to believe there was any foul play involved. The sergeant said the words, but somehow Colin didn't think he believed them. Shit! He was sure to have seen the handkerchief in the man's mouth. Were they really going to try to arrest him for this? My God, how hard did you hit him? Caleb ran his hand through his hair and began pacing back and forth between the desks. You heard him speaking to Mr. Grayson, didn't you? He turned to the sergeant. Bryce told him he thought I'd be a better choice for the partnership. Colin could sense the walls closing in around him. He hadn't heard it in so many words, but Bryce had been furious with him last week. No, I didn't hear anything about it. In fact, Mr. Grayson helped me straighten myself out. He said I was an excellent lawyer, and that's why they hired me. And yet you got drunk again last night. Caleb looked him up and down. Bryce took you to task for it when you came in, didn't he? I didn't even see the man this morning, and why would he reprimand me anyway? I might have a bit of a headache, but my appearance is up to snuff, even for him. That's enough, the two of you. The sergeant's voice took on a tone of authority. Mr. Bradley, I suggest you sit behind your desk. I'll be over to question you when I'm done with Mr. Brissedon. Question me? For what? Sergeant Owens rose from his seat, his hand on his hips. Sit down, Mr. Bradley. Without another word, the clerk did as he was told. The constable came out of Bryce's office and whispered something in the sergeant's ear, causing him to frown. Stay here, the two of you, and try not to kill each other. When the officer had gone into Bryce's office, Caleb turned back to Colin. Why'd you have to kill him? Grayson's not going to keep all three of us on if it's just him. I didn't kill him. Colin pinched the bridge of his nose. He probably just had an apoplexy or maybe drank himself to death. He really wasn't any better than me, you know. Owens came back out of the office, a dour look etched across his normally pleasant face. May I see your fingers, Mr. Brissedon? Colin showed him his hands, and Owens nodded. That's ink, isn't it? Yes, I told you I was working on a brief for Mr. Bryce. The pen must have leaked a bit. So if you touch something like a collar or a handkerchief, it might transfer some of the ink? Yes, I suppose so. Where was the policeman going with this? Just like the ink on Mr. Bryce's collar, or the handkerchief shoved in his mouth. What? No, I mean, I was checking to see if he was dead. I don't think I touched his collar, but I have my handkerchief right here. He checked his pockets, growing more frantic by the minute. He'd had it when he'd spoken with Mrs. Davis. I must have dropped it outside. It was so hot, I'd been wiping my brow and the back of my neck. I don't think I touched his collar, though, did I? Seems like maybe you did, son. The sergeant rubbed his chin. I'm thinking maybe we'd best be taking you in for questioning. Leastways till the doc gets a better idea of what went on here. You're arresting me? Colin shot out of his seat. On what grounds? Checking a man's pulse? You have no proof I did anything beyond that. That handkerchief of yours, did it have your initials on it? Yes, but what does that have to do with anything? I'm not the only man with a monogram on my handkerchief. No, that's true enough, but it does give me ample reason to hold you for questioning, especially since just such a handkerchief was shoved down Mr. Bryce's throat. A handkerchief, I might add, that has smudges of ink all over it. Add to that your recent altercation with the deceased and your timely presence here this morning, and I think even you'll have to admit I'm well without my rights." Colin's thoughts were crashing into one another. How could this be happening? He needed help. Kathleen. "No, wait, please. My sister. Let me telephone her and tell her what's happened. She'll be worried if she doesn't hear from me." Not strictly true, but it did the trick. The sergeant picked up the receiver of the cradle telephone on Colin's desk and rang for the operator, handing the receiver to Colin. "Go on then, but make it quick." Colin wiped a hand on his pants before taking it. "Yes, exchange 59A, please." Forbes answered a moment later, but Colin could barely speak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "It's Colin. Please tell my sister I'm in trouble. There's been a murder, and I'm being taken in for questioning." "Yes, of course, sir, but who is it the authorities think you've murdered?" Colin felt ill and his head was throbbing. Could this all be nothing more than an alcohol-induced nightmare? But no, it was all too real. Mr. Bryce, my boss,